Kingside.com. Kingside.com.
Hello and welcome to the lesson on PHP variables. Well, we'll start this with my face showing, but I really don't want you to look at my face. Well, two things I've never understood about online videos, programming videos. Number one is, why do people put their face up in front? It doesn't convey any programming knowledge looking at my face. Number two is the typing, the endless typing. Why do people type so much when they're trying to do a programming video? So I've designed these videos quite differently. Number one, don't look at this face. It's not worth looking at. It's not like I look like this or that. Those two faces might make my wife happier, but they're not going to make you learn programming better. What I want you to concentrate on these videos is the red underline. I'm going to highlight code. When I talk about a piece of code, I'm going to highlight it with a red underline. Sometimes I'll put an arrow next to it. Look at the highlights that I put on the slides, and that's what I'll be talking about. Even the text that I put up is more for when you pause the video. If I'm saying something that you don't understand it, hit pause on the video, look at the red underline, look at the text that I put up, and that will allow you to understand the code better. So for now, let's cut the face. Click. Now, back to PHP variables. According to dictionary.com, a variable is likely to change or vary, subject to variation, changeable. My definition of a variable is a location in computer memory where I can store something. I've always thought of variables as little cubby holes where I can store something that I'll need later. In PHP, we are what's called a loosely typed programming language. There is no requirement in PHP to declare up front what type of variable you are and things like that. Anytime, any place, anywhere in PHP, you can declare a variable. That's what it means. The other thing about PHP is they always start with a dollar sign. PHP variables start with a dollar sign. So what I'm going to do here is create a variable called $exposition. It's where I'm going to store the x coordinate of where I'm keeping my character on the screen. And you can see I don't even have to assign it a value. I can just declare exposition, and it'll allocate a little piece of memory in RAM to hold that variable. Right now I have a couple of question marks in there because I haven't assigned it a value. I really can't use it until I assign it a value. Now let me set up a variable called $position and assign an initial value. You can see once again it goes out into RAM memory and it reserves some space to hold something. In this case it's holding the integer 50. So I'm creating the variable position and assigning it a value at the same time. This is my preferred way to create a variable. To be honest with you, in PHP you can create a variable anytime, any place, anywhere in the code. I like to put my variables up at the top of the code so I can see and find them. So up at the top of the code I like to put out my variables. Now let's say we have a game that's keeping track of money. The player collects money, the player spends money. That value is going to go up and down, so I'm going to create a variable $money and assign it a value 20.0. And what's different here is that decimal point. We're creating what's called a float data type. We're going to store a number with a decimal point. Position stores an integer, a number without a decimal point. $money is going to store a variable with a decimal point. So that's what we have there, is a float type and an int type. Next up is what we'll call a string type. PHP doesn't have what we call a character variable type, but it does have a string, and you can assign a string one single letter. So $rank is a player, an A ranked player, a B ranked player, a C ranked player, is going to contain one single letter. It's a string that contains one letter, in this case uppercase A. Another data type is what's called a Boolean data type. A Boolean data type can hold true or false. In this case, paid user is a variable, it's allocated memory, that can hold just true or false. I've assigned it true, and you can see it has the initial value true there in computer memory. Those four data types that we saw here are four data types that are very commonly used in computer programming. Position is the int data type, a number without a decimal point. Money is a float data type, a number with a decimal point. Rank is a string. Right now it only contains one character. And paid user is a Boolean variable. These are the various data types that we'll be using as we program or learn to program a video game, as we learn to program in PHP. Okay, now when creating variables, there's three things you have to worry about: name, type, and value. Variables have a name. Descriptive names are good. Short abbreviated names are bad. Give the variable a name that describes what you're storing in the variable. If you look at this first variable, score equals 0. Score is the value that the player, or the points that the player accumulates as they're playing the game. It's their current score. So name it score. Don't name it S. Don't name it SC. Name it score to describe what you're storing in that variable. Variables have a type. What are you storing? What are you storing? A whole number, an int, a decimal number, a float, letters, a string, or a Boolean true false? What type of data is being stored? Remember, a variable is a location in computer memory where you can store something. What are you storing in that location? In the case of score, the type is int, a number without a decimal point. Variables have a value. What is the current contents of the space allocated? What am I storing in computer memory? In the case of this one, we're storing a 0. So always focus on the name, type, and value of the variable. Looking at the next variable, health equals 100. Health equals 100. The name obviously is health. It's the health score for our player. As the player gets stronger, their health score goes up. As the player gets weaker, they take damage, their health score goes down. And of course, if their health score goes to 0, the player might die on that level. So the health is keeping track of how healthy the current player is. Good name, especially if health is written on the screen. A lot of times on video games you'll see here's your current score, here's the time elapsed, here's your health value. Name the variables to match what you see on the screen. We're keeping track of the player's health in that variable. Name is health. The type in this case is an integer. 100 is a number without a decimal point, and the value 100. Strength equals 4.67. The name strength implies how strong is this character. When they punch, how much damage will they do? The strength is a floating point number, so the type is float. 4.67 does have a decimal point in it, so that makes it a float number as opposed to an int number. The value 4.67, I just made up that number, but I want the strength to go up and down slowly. If you work out, your strength goes up a little bit, so I want to be able to add a fraction of a strength value to it. If you get real tired, you have to run a long distance, I want my player's strength to go down. So strength needs to be a float, so I have a little more control over the value that's stored in it. Any number with a decimal point is going to be a float type. Next up, screen name equals Hank. Name obviously is screen name. During games, players are often asked to give themselves a handle or a screen name that'll display on the screen. Online games, you definitely have a screen name. So use the variable name that matches. Now we could have called this $SN, short for screen name. But when you look at $SN, you don't understand what's being stored in it. And you can't understand when something bad gets stored into it. So give it a full, solid descriptive name. Sure, it'll take you a little longer to type in $screen name. But it's so much easier to read the code when your variables have descriptive names. Obviously, the type is string. This is a string of characters, and the value is Hank, the 4 characters HANK. So focus on the name, type, and value when you're looking at variables in the code. And always give your variables descriptive names. That way, when you're reading the code, you can understand it. Once we have our variables created and the program is running, we've got to find ways to change the variables. So let's look at some of the operations that will change the value stored in a variable. We'll start with an x position equals 60. You can see we're storing the value 60 in RAM memory. Remember, a variable is a location in computer memory where I can store something. In this case, I'm storing the position on the x-axis. Now I drew a character here at roughly position 60 on my x-axis to show you what happens to the character when the x position changes. I'm going to say x position equals x position plus 2. And I'm going to break this line up into two parts. First, we're going to do the right side of the equals assignment operator, and we're going to retrieve x position from RAM memory. We're going to grab the 60 out of RAM memory. After we grab the 60, we'll add 2 to it and get the result of 62. After the math is done on the right side, we will assign the result to the variable on the left side. Now notice how x position went up by 2. We've changed x position from 60 to 62 using this line of code. This is called the assignment operator, the equal sign, and we added 2 to the variable and stored the result back into x position. And I don't know if you noticed, but if you look closely, my little character there at the bottom of the screen moved over a little bit on the x position axis. When x position changes, the position of my character changes. That's what x position is. Where on the x-axis is the character located? Now let's take a little closer look on this next one. We're going to retrieve the current contents of the x position variable, the 62. We're going to add 5 to it to come up with 67, and we're going to store the result back into x position. And if you saw, my character moved another 5 positions on the x-axis. That's what the x position variable does. It keeps track of where your character is located. You change that variable, you change the position of your character. Now these hard-coded +2s and +5s, that's not the best way to code. These are called literals. The literal value 2 and the literal value 5. We tend not to want to code like that. I show it this way at first because it's the easiest way to look at it and see what's changing. But now I'm going to do something slightly different. I'm going to set up another variable here called speed. Now speed, as the name implies, is going to control how fast the character will move. So I'll set a speed of 3, which means I want the character to move by 3 positions every time we add to x position. So I'm going to use the variable speed as the second operand in the plus here. And now I'm going to have to retrieve 2 values. I'm going to pull the 67 for x position. I'm going to pull the 3 for speed and do 67 plus 3. And of course, I'm going to come up with 70. Look at this character here. It's going to move when I hit the button. So my character moved to position 70 when x position changed to 70. Are you getting the picture? A variable is a location in computer memory that changes as the program executes. When your character wants to move, it's got to change its x position. Here's another advantage of using a variable to control the speed of the character. Up till now, I've been moving my character to the right. As x position gets bigger, you move to the right on the x-axis. Now I'm going to set speed to -6. I'm going to change speed to a negative number, and it's going to be slightly larger, absolute value-wise, than it was before. Now I'm going to do 2 things. I'm going to change the direction of the character so it moves to the left, and I'm going to have it move faster than it did before. By using a variable for the speed rather than a hard-coded 2 or 5, I'm going to be able to change not only the speed of the character, but the direction of the character. So what happens on this line of code? First, we do the right side of the assignment operator, and it says pull the value 70 from the x position variable. Then it pulls the value -6 from the speed variable, and when it does 70 plus -6, x position goes down. My character moved to the left this time because my speed was a negative number. Are you getting it? X position and Y position are 2 of the most important variables to keep track of our character in a video game. Now I'm just moving along the x-axis here, so I'm not adjusting the y. This is also a time when maybe I can talk about a lot of times programmers will call these two variables x and y. Everybody knows what x and y is. It's your coordinate on the x and y axis. So in that one case, I'll say, okay, let's use a short variable name like x and y. But in this example, I used x position instead of this simple x to show you what I want you to do most of the time. And most of the time is I want you to give variables good descriptive names. Always ask yourself, does the name of the variable reflect what I'm storing into it? Does x position reflect the character's position on the x-axis? Yes, it does. Does speed control how fast the character moves? Absolutely. Call it speed. Give your variables good names, and your code is easy to read and understand. Give your variables short, cryptic names, and your code is hard to read and hard to understand. Now let's look at a special case. Sometimes we want to store a location in computer memory that never changes. A variable is so named because it varies, it changes. But sometimes we want to set up what's called a constant. And that's what we're going to do on this line of PHP. We're going to define start x to be 10. And what that means is everywhere you see start x in the code, I want you to interpret that as a 10. I want you to substitute a 10. So what we're going to do is set up a sort of non-variable variable, a constant, something that doesn't change. Every time we use the value start x, or the variable name start x, notice there's no $sign in constants, we're going to use 10. So when I define start x to be 10, and then I set x position equal to start x, I'm really saying I want that 10 in the constant to be assigned to my variable. You can see my variable change to 10, and you can also see my character slid over to position 10 on the screen. So there you have it. There's just some of the things that you can do with variables to change them. You've got to use an assignment operator. You'll be doing some sort of arithmetic operator. All the common arithmetic operators, plus, minus, multiply, divide, are supported. If you can do third grade math, you can do variable changing. You can do arithmetic operations on variables and change their values. Float and char question mark. Char because PHP doesn't really have a char data type. It has the string type, and if you put one letter in it, it's a single character. So again, we're just modifying variables. We're seeing how variables work. Again, I want you to kind of picture a video game screen, right? Video game screens aren't all graphics. They put up some stuff like your screen name, your current score, the elapsed time that you've been doing, your health value. You've got to have that sort of information to display to the user. One of the things we're going to have on our screen is we're going to have a money. Players collect money and they spend money during this game. We've got to tell the player on the screen how much is their current balance. What do they have in the bank, so to speak? We also want to show them their current ranking. We're going to use a simple grade scale of A being a highly ranked player, C being an average player, and F being a low ranked player. Let's display the user's money and ranking on the screen. And let's have variables in the code that provide the values for the screen output. So I'm going to set up $money equals 50.49. What's the name? What's the type? What's the value? The name is money. The type is float because we need a decimal point. And finally, the value is 50.49. So you can see over here in RAM memory, we have assigned a value into that location for that variable money. Money changes. You spend money, it goes down. You acquire money, it goes up. So we're going to do a little math. We're going to use the minus or subtract arithmetic operator and say $money minus 12.34. First thing we have to do is the right side of the equation and pull the 50.49 out of the variable. We'll subtract the 12.34 from that value and store the result back into money. 38.15 is the result of the equation, and that's what gets stored in there. Look down here. The screen that is showing the current balance for the player updates too. For every value, every number, everything you see on the screen of a video game, there's got to be a corresponding variable behind the scenes in the code that is tracking that value that gets displayed on the screen. Again, since the screen is labeled money, let's call the variable money. Once again, I'm not too crazy about this hard-coded minus 12.34 here. Hard-coded values, literals like this, tend not to be a good programming practice. Let's use a variable for how much things cost. So let's set up a variable called cost. We'll set cost equals a 7.11 or 711, and that'll be the cost of the thing that we want to buy. So when we actually update our money, we'll take our current balance, which is 38.15, pull that from the variable, and we'll subtract out the cost as expressed in the variable, 7.11, and we'll get a result of 31.04. And you can see not only does the variable change to 31.04, but since this is used to display the screen, 3104 shows up on our screen. Get in the picture? Try not to use hard-coded values. When you initially set up a variable and put an initial value in it, that's okay to put a hard-coded. But as you're doing cost, as you're buying things, different things have different prices. You're going to want to use variables as the cost and subtract out the cost to get the new values. Now let's look at a string or character. Once again, PHP only has a string type. It doesn't have a specific character type. What we're setting up here is a string with a single character in it. And it's the ranking of the player. A means you're a highly ranked player. F means you're a lowly ranked player. The ranking of this player is C, just average. And we'll initialize it or start the player with an average ranking. Now I want to show you some of the things we can do with characters and how we can modify them and manipulate them. What I'm going to do is run an ORD function, O-R-D, that's the ordinal. I'm going to pull out the C, which is a character, and I'm going to convert it to a number. Everything in computer memory is a number. So what I'm going to do is convert rank over to its ASCII value. Now, when I convert this character to a number, I can then do math on it. So I'm going to subtract 1 from that character C. Now, what happens when you subtract 1 from the character C? Well, a couple of things. First of all, the rank changed to 66. This is an important thing that you have to understand about PHP. PHP is a loosely typed language. Just because there was a string in the variable rank on the line above doesn't mean there's a string in the variable rank on this line. What we just did is we converted that character C to a number, which was 67. We subtracted 1 from it and stored the result back into the same variable. So technically rank changed in 2 ways. It changed from a string to an int, and it changed from a C to a B. Rank is currently the number 66, which is actually the code for the letter B. So what I want to do is convert it back to a string. On the next line of code, I'll run the char function, or CHR, and what that does is it takes the number that was stored in rank, converts it back to a letter, and stores it back as a string. What happened there at the end is rank went from a string to a number back to a string. And I did that to illustrate a point. Just because a variable starts with a certain type in it doesn't mean it will stay that type. You could have the same variable initially hold an int, and then later in the code it can hold a string, then later in the code it could hold a boolean. Now that's not a good thing. I'm not saying that you should go out and keep changing the types of your variables, but you've got to be aware with it. Many times we'll get bugs or problems because a variable suddenly changes type. You've got to be very careful. I myself prefer to keep those variables with the same type. I start them at the top with an int in them. I keep them an int through the entire execution of the program. Let's do a little bit more math. We've done with plus, we've done addition, we've done subtraction, the minus sign. Let's do a little bit more math and see how it works. One thing games quite often do is they keep track of the elapsed time. So a player will start a level and it will keep track of how long it took you to complete that level. So we're going to track the elapsed times for a certain game level. Now I've decided we need three variables to do this: minutes, seconds, and time. Notice how I didn't initialize them here. I just set them up as variables. Again, I like to put the declaration or the initial use of my variables at the top of my code so I can see what I'm dealing with. So that's all I did, is I set up these variables. I didn't even assign them values, so we'll do that below. Now, $time equals 125. The easiest way to track time inside of a computer is by seconds. 125 is meant to represent 125 seconds. You don't keep track of minutes, hours, days. You keep track of the number of seconds, and then you do some math on it to figure out the minutes, the hours, and the days. This basically means the player has been playing for 125 seconds, and that's what the variable time is showing us. Now let's do some math to convert seconds to minute second format that we're used to seeing on the screen. So if the total elapsed time of this level is 125 seconds, how do you calculate the minutes? Well, you divide by 60. We're going to take the time in total seconds and divide by 60. If I divide by 60, the result should be the number of minutes. Now I've done some special jiggering here to do what's called integer division. Integer division says when I divide two numbers, I want an integer result. So I'm going to do my 60 divided by 125, and I can do that one in my head, but the answer is 2. 60 goes into 125 twice. Now, the problem with this equation is the division returns a floating point number. It returns a number with a decimal point, and I don't really want the decimal point in this case. So what I'm going to do is use what's called the floor function and round down the answer. So instead of being 2 point blah 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 blah, it's going to be 2.0. So I'll round this down to 2, get rid of the numbers after the decimal point, and then I'm going to do what's called a typecast. Convert it back to an int. So minutes will end up being 2. And you can see when it completes this equation, the variable minutes will contain the value 2. Not 2.1, not 2.22, not 2.3, but the actual int 2. This is what's called integer division. I know this equation could yield a decimal point. So using the floor and the int typecast, I want to get rid of what's after the decimal point and just store 2. And that makes sense, right? 125 seconds contains 2 minutes. Now what's left over? What's left over is the extra 5 seconds. If you look over here on my little division equation here, 60 divides into 125 twice with a remainder of 5. What's left over is 5 seconds. Now again, we don't want the decimal point. We don't want 2.11 blah 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 blah. We want 2 minutes 5 seconds. So what I'm going to do here is what's called the modulus or the remainder operator. Now what the modulus operator does is it divides by 60 and returns the remainder. Whenever you do integer division, you get 2 results. This is how many times the number goes into it, and here's the remainder when it's left over. So what we're really doing here is saying do time divided by 60 and calculate the remainder. So that remainder of 5 is what's going to be stored in seconds. Using the elapsed time of 125 seconds, I do a little bit math and I calculate that that took 2 minutes and 5 seconds. And when I update my screen to show the player the current elapsed time of the level, you can see on the left side of the colon, the 2 I got from the minutes variable, and on the right side, the 5 I got from the seconds variable. And this is something we do quite often in computer programming. Sometimes it's more convenient to store something in a different format and then modify it before we show it to the user. Much easier to keep track of seconds But nobody wants to show seconds on the screen. We want to see, how many hours, how many minutes, and then how many seconds are left over. So we do a little math so we can update and show the screen properly. Now, just so we get this idea of how division works in PHP, show the difference between integer division and floating point division. I'm going to do test equals floor 1 divided by 2. Now 1 divided by 2 can be thought of two ways. 1 divided by 2 could be 0 because 2 doesn't go into 1 at all. Or 1 divided by 2 could be 0.5. It depends on whether you're dealing with decimal points or not dealing with decimal points. In this case, if I do not want a fractional part, if I want to do 1 divided by 2 and not deal with a decimal point, I'll use the floor function, and the floor function will say rounded down. And 1 divided by 2 gets rounded down to 0, as you can see in my variable test. But what if I do want the decimal point? Well, don't use the floor. If I say test2 equals 1 divided by 2, by default, PHP will do floating point arithmetic. I'll get a 0.5 as my result, and you can see that test2 holds the 0.5. Always be aware when you're doing arithmetic. Do I want the decimal point or do I not want to use the decimal point? The default is to produce a fractional answer. So you don't have to do anything if you want the decimal point. If you don't, you're going to have to use floor and sometimes int if you want it converted straight to an int type in order to make sure that you don't have a decimal point in your result. Let's look at the string type. Remember, when it comes to variables, there's three things we got to worry about. What is the name of the variable? What is the type of the variable? And what is the current value of the variable? Let's look at a type called string, which obviously is letters. It's a string of characters. In PHP, strings are not objects. Other languages like Java, strings are objects. But in PHP, strings are not objects. Let's set up two variables. $name. $name, I will not give it an assignment. So look at what it says for $name. It says undefined. It just means I haven't assigned a value to it yet. But this second variable, $len, or length, short for length, I'm going to put an initial value in it of 2. So when I set up that variable, you can see that the 2 shows up in that variable. These are the two variables I'm going to work on. Again, I like to declare or initially use my variables at the top of the code so I know what I'm dealing with when I get farther down in the code. Let's assign name a initial value. I'm going to say name equals Mario and say I want to store the letters M-A-R-I-O in my variable name, and you can see Mario showed up in our variable. Strings contain characters. Anything in these quotes are the characters that I'll assign to the name variable. Now you can manipulate or change strings, but you can't change them the same way you change numbers. So let me show you the first way you can modify or tweak with a string. I'm going to say name equals name dot brothers. Well, $name contains Mario. So we're going to extract Mario from this variable, and Mario will be the left-hand operator. Then this period, this is called the dot operator. It's a simple period from your keyboard. It says I want to concatenate, or I want to add to name the string brothers. So what I'm going to do is take Mario and brothers and concatenate them into a bigger string. What I'm doing is basically addition. I'm adding two strings together. In PHP, we use the dot operator to concatenate two strings into a bigger string. So you can see what happened here. Mario and brothers got smushed together to form Mario Brothers. If you're going to manipulate strings, if you're going to add to a current string variable, we need to use the dot operator in PHP. There's another way to change a string variable too that's a little more interesting. Notice the change here. I'm putting this in double quotes. If you look very closely here, this is double quote $name space $len end of double quote. PHP does something special when you put variables in double quotes. It substitutes the current value of variables for $name. So look at this arrow over here. Name contains Mario Brothers. I'm going to take Mario Brothers and substitute it in this position of the string. I'm then going to have a space after it and grab the length, the 2 from here, and $len, the 2 is going to go here. So what I'm doing here is smooshing together Mario Brothers in 2 and making a bigger, larger string out of it. If you look carefully at the result of what happens here is $name now contains Mario Brothers 2. The Mario Brothers parts came from $name. The 2 came from $len. Perhaps the most important thing you should know about PHP strings is the difference between single quotes and double quotes. Up here, single quote Mario into single quotes, no variable substitution would occur at all. Even if you had a variable named Mario, it wouldn't change this with the contents of the variable. But when you use these double quotes here, what will happen is variable substitution. Whatever is in $name, Mario Brothers, whatever is in $len, 2, will substitute into this string before being assigned there. You have two ways to modify or add to a string. You can use the dot operator, or you can use variable substitution inside of double quotes. Another important thing to understand about strings is PHP has dozens of string functions, code that will change or tell you things or modify a string variable. The first one up is called strlen, string length. There's many of them. Whenever you see a function that starts with str, it's a function that modifies or tells you something about the string. In the case of the string length, it's going to tell us how many characters are in the string. So we're going to pass it what's called a parameter name, and it's going to count. It's going to come up here and count 1, 2, 3. It's going to count that there are 15 characters in $name. And once it's determined that there are 15 characters in $name, it will store the result in the length variable. So string length will return how many characters are stored in the string, and we stored it in $len and got a 15. And again, there's dozens of these str functions. Just to show you another one, str to upper. String to uppercase is what this is short for. Again, we'll pass it an input of Mario Brothers 2. Now you can see this is a mixture of upper and lowercase. Big M, big B, the rest of it is lowercase. I want to convert that all to strictly uppercase, so it will take that input, convert it all to uppercase, and store the result back into the name variable. And there we got it. Mario Brothers 2, all in uppercase, stored there. I don't have time to go over dozens and dozens of these str functions, but they're out there. And if you go out to the PHP documentation, or you go to Google and type in PHP space str, it'll start showing you a bunch of these string functions. Or you can Google PHP string functions and it'll give you a list of them. That should be enough to get you started on using variables. Remember, 3 important things you've got to remember when it comes to variable. So what is the variable name? Give it a good descriptive name that describes what you're storing in it. Variable type, is it a string? Is it an int? Is it a float? Is it a boolean? And variable value. The current value of $len is 15. The current value of $name is Mario Brothers 2. Always look at variables and think, well, what are the 3 important features of this variable?